Thank you so much, Kim, and good morning. And I want to echo Kim's thoughts around how great it is to see everyone again, even if we're only seeing the top half of your face. And it's been kind of weird because now coming back and seeing everyone after a few years and trying to recognize everyone through the mask has been a little bit daunting. So I think for all of us, we have to give each other a little pass if at first we don't recognize you. But great to see everybody here. And I was actually surprised to see how many people were coming in person to the conference, and that's really reassuring. I'm very excited to see that. I want to talk about collaboration, about the Japan Institute coming up, but I want to talk about just quickly a collaboration that we are putting on in June, and I want to invite you all to come in June to Portland. We will be hosting the American Public Gardens Association National Conference in June, and it is an opportunity for us as a field of Japanese gardens to stand up and say, hey, we matter, we exist, we are an important component of the field of public gardens, not only in North America, but around the world. And APGA represents 600 gardens from 20 different countries, and this is really our moment to shine as a field. So I want to encourage you all to look into coming to that conference, and we're happy to welcome you back to Portland again. So let's see if I can figure out how to make this work. Okay. So Japan Institute, talk a little bit about collaboration, and I think if you talk to any of my staff, they will tell you that collaboration is really the cornerstone of what we do at the Portland Japanese Garden. When I came to the garden 16 years ago now, we did not have much in the way of programming, and the garden was kind of it was a beautiful place to come and visit, and there was the occasional exhibition that we would do in conjunction with the Japan Foundation, but there really wasn't much else from that standpoint. And kind of early on, as I got to know the organization and in fact traveled to Japan, and this all is relevant to the conversations around the formation of NAJGA, there was this realization that while we were considered to be one of the most authentic Japanese gardens in the world outside of Japan, and that was an honor and a badge that we carried, we in fact did not play well with others. And I remember going to Washington, D.C. early on and meeting with Holly Shimizu, who was the director of the U.S. Botanic Garden at that time, and she said, you know, she said, in my mind, there are 3 gardens in the country that are the best at what they do. I can't remember, I think Bush Art Gardens was one of them, and we were one, and there was another. And she said, but the thing about these 3 gardens is, even though they're so good at what they do, they don't interact with the rest of the field. And that really struck me, and I thought, well, gee, if we have worked so hard after all these years to be recognized in this way, isn't it our responsibility to be reaching out and engaging with our larger communities and fields, whether that's locally, nationally, or internationally? And that very first visit with her really changed my direction in terms of where I wanted to go and what I wanted to do with and for the Portland Japanese Garden. And you're going to see how that has evolved over time and some of the things that we are now looking at doing. I think first and foremost, let's see if this is going to move. There we go. So it was the garden, and in going off on my International Affairs Fellowship in 2008, 2009, was my opportunity to go to Japan and understand the field better. I also did, just in advance of that, what I called a perspective tour of North America, looking at many of your gardens to kind of understand where were we in kind of the realm of Japanese gardens. And through all of that came the realization, both here in North America and in Japan, that there was this giant gap, that there was no collaboration that was going on, first of all in North America, much less between Japan and North America. And in fact, that unless you spoke Japanese, you had the money, you had the time, and you found a sensei who would take you on for no less than 6 years of practice, the first 3 years of which were sweeping the grounds, then how were you going to learn all of these specialized techniques in terms of design, construction, and maintenance of Japanese gardens? And so in collaboration with Sada Uchiyama, our chief curator, who had to return home yesterday, we began conceiving of this idea of the International Japanese Garden Training Center. And so going way back to the very beginning, we had this garden director system. And so we were fortunate that we had garden directors who were brought from Japan. They lived in our community for 3 or 4 years at a time. And over a 25-year period, they really built out the master plan of Professor Tono, Takuma Tono from Tokyo Agricultural University, who had designed the garden. So we were fortunate, but we understood, I came to understand that most gardens out there did not have the benefit of that. So from a training standpoint, from a maintenance standpoint, construction, there was not the knowledge. And so these gardens across North America, they were built, but nobody thought about the then what. We're going to build this garden, and then what? Who's going to take care of it? Often they were, as you know, part of city park systems that were left to be dilapidated and run down. And so we came up with this idea of building a training center to which you can come. And here you can see our 8 former garden directors, along with our current chief curator, Sada Uchiyama, who we brought together shortly after my time in Japan there. And so that was the basis for how we started to move forward and think about our program. It was really started with the garden itself. And so this has all led to what we call the Japan Institute. And so if you look here, the Japan Institute is kind of will be comprised of 3 different sections. One is the International Japanese Garden Training Center, one is a Global Center for Culture and Art, and one is an International Exchange Forum. And all of these are really based in the tenets of collaboration that we started some 15 years ago, and now have gotten to the point where we're taking it to the next level. I'll talk first about the Global Center for Culture and Art. Talked a little bit about how this whole conversation started. And around the same time as we were realizing that there was no collaboration in terms of the garden training, we also realized that we were not utilizing the garden as a platform the way we should to teach about so many things of the culture, the art, the design of Japan. And so I hired a woman by the name of Diane Durston. Many of you know her. She retired a couple of years ago, and charged her with really beginning to take the garden itself and make it this venue or this platform for art exhibitions, for cultural programs, for food series, for anything that you can think of. And of course, I hired Diane Durston. It was out of the conversation about having collaboration with the Portland Art Museum. That was the whole premise under which I went to go visit her when she was a curator of education at the Portland Art Museum, was to collaborate with the Art Museum. And in fact, I offered her a job and stole her away from the Art Museum. And I should say collaboration leads to many different things. Engagement with your audiences, engagement with the people, with our visitors, but it also is a great way to recruit people. Aki Nakanishi, who's my curator of culture, art, and education in the back there. I met Aki 12 or 13 years ago because of our collaborations with the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo, and we worked together for 12 years before I ever hired him. And Hugo Tori, who I believe is in that back corner, who is our garden curator. I've known Hugo Tori for maybe 8 or 9 years, and I met him because of collaborations that we were doing with Kato Zoen, the Kato Landscape Company in Kyoto. And so you get to know people on a different level, and then you're able to recruit really good, smart people. So we started doing these exhibitions and performances and all kinds of cultural programs at the garden. It really reaped benefits for us, because what we saw through these collaborations was by working with the Art Museum, by working with performing arts, by working with different culinary programs, that we were actually building membership, that we were cross-pollinating with those other audiences and drawing those people in. As a matter of fact, one of the biggest donors to the Portland Art Museum was a woman by the name of Arlene Schnitzer. And Arlene had not been to the garden in more than 25 years when I arrived at the garden. We did our first, one of our very first exhibitions we did at the garden was of Jun Kaneko, a glass exhibition that we installed glass out into the garden. It was very controversial at the time. But what it did was it brought Arlene Schnitzer to the garden for the first time in 25 years. And what that did was 3 years later, Arlene gave $6 million and was the lead gift for our $37 million expansion. So you can see how this kind of collaboration and these kinds of activities in the garden can make a big difference if you're strategic about it. This was a collaboration we did with Shochiku, which is the kabuki company out of Tokyo, the major producer of kabuki in Japan. And they did not necessarily want to do this. They said, it's a garden. Why would we come and perform in a garden? At first they wouldn't even give me a meeting, and I had to use some of my networks and get a meeting forced on them. And then I made the pitch, and they begrudgingly decided to do it. And they came to the garden, and it was such a success, and our audience that loved it so much, and they loved it so much that they have now come back to us, and they want to do more, and they want to do bigger, and they want us to help them tour this troupe across the west coast of the United States on their next tour. And then collaboration with our local tea schools as well. So it's a range of international collaborators, artists, artisans, as well as people who just live in our community who want to participate in the garden. Oh, and there's always good wine tasting and whiskey tasting, and yes, sake tasting. So that's what we're going to be calling the Center for Global Center for Culture and Art. And the difference now between the programs that we've been doing and what will be under the umbrella of the Japan Institute is really that we are taking it a next step, and we're looking for further collaborations beyond just the Portland community. So that when we do an exhibition, we may collaborate with an artist or with the Portland Art Museum, but we've spent all that time and that resource and that knowledge in putting that exhibition together, and now we want to be able to share that out beyond Portland so that we can travel that exhibition. So if you at your garden want to share that exhibition, we can take it to Louisville, Kentucky, or we can take it to London, England, or we can take it to Sao Paulo, Brazil. So designing it in such a way, but also commissions of live performances of new works to be done with these artists, and then, as I mentioned with the kabuki, be able to travel them around the country or around the world. To bring in artists in residence who will stay in Portland for 3 months or 6 months or a year, and then to exhibit their work, and then again to be able to share those exhibitions with gardens outside of Portland's boundary. That's really one of the goals of the Global Center for Culture and Art. And then the International Japanese Garden Training Center. And this work we've been doing for the last several years, and many of you have participated in our intensive training seminars or some of our lectures and workshops. And our goal here is really to expand that. It's again through collaboration with our friends in Japan that we have been able to bring the best of the best in terms of faculty and training here to Portland, to North America, to teach these skills. Our next phase of this collaboration is, and I'm going to talk about the campus a little in a few minutes, but we're going to be able to bring people in and in cooperation with the Japanese government and with the Garden Society of Japan, we're going to be able, and I should say the University of Oregon Landscape Architecture Department, we are going to be able to offer certification, just as they do in Japan, in Japanese gardens, and design, construction, and maintenance in Japanese gardens if you take a certain amount of coursework. So we are aligning the requirements that the Garden Society of Japan has with the requirements that we will have for our certification program, so that, but we're doing it in English in an intensive training seminar format. And here you see, again, collaboration across the board. Which also is not just about adult education, but also about education for our youth through our Haiku Alive program, which we are now looking for collaborators on 6 continents to do a Poems for Peace project over the next 3 years. And then our third component of this is the International Exchange Forum. And this is really about having conversations about shared ideals that we have with Japan around the world. And that can be anything from environmental sustainability to issues of internal peace and tranquility that we have, spiritual peace that the gardens bring us, but also world peace. And I think I came to realize some years ago that what we're really about is peace. That there's this idea that through culture, art, and nature, that we can come to help each other understand each other better, right? And this was the idea after World War II and why we were founded, was, gee, if we just understood each other a little better, we're less willing to go to war with each other. This idea of cultural diplomacy. And so we want to have this conversation. We want to tell this story because we believe we're a really successful example of this cultural diplomacy. Tell a story of our original garden director, Mr. Hira, who was on that picture earlier in the slide. And Mr. Hira came when he was 23 or 24 years old from Japan, and he lived in Portland for 3 or 4 years. And Portland at that time was still a place that had demonstrations, but it was a very different place. There was still a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment in the community. And so he lived in a trailer on the site where the garden was being constructed. And in fact, there were demonstrations by the community against the garden being built because the demonstrators would come up and they would shout, "Go home, Jap, you killed my father." And there was a lot of raw emotion still from the war. It was less than 20 years after the war. At one point, there was a group of demonstrators that stoned him. And on one occasion, there was a group of demonstrators that stabbed him, and he almost died. This is Portland, Oregon, who now seems so socially justice-filled in today's society, but this was a different time back in 1963. And so Kinya Hira vowed he'd never return to Portland, that his experience was so bad there that he would never return. Well, when I came and I tried to get all those gentlemen together back for that reunion, I went to Hira-san and I asked him, will you return for this event? And he said no. He said, I told you I wouldn't, I vowed I wouldn't return and I won't. Well, it took about a year of talking with him and his daughters to convince him to come back, and he did. And this amazing thing happened for him, for the community, and for me and my realization of what the garden really, truly is all about. Over the course of that week, we had events in which he walked through the garden and he taught, they told people what they built, why, and why they used the materials, and living histories as they walked through the garden. And we had a black tie fundraiser, and 500 people showed up and gave $500 each to support the garden directors and to express their appreciation. And then we had 1,000 people at the Portland Art Museum show up for a panel discussion. And an amazing thing happened. Kinya Hira saw what this garden had become in this community, that had gone from this place where they didn't want it so badly that they almost killed him, to this place where it had become the most revered cultural institution of the state of Oregon. And this same community that didn't want this organization was now investing $37 million of private money to expand it. And he realized that the garden had done its job. That over 40 to 50 years, this slow drip of culture, art, and nature had in fact changed attitudes about the Japanese people in the minds of Oregonians and in the minds of Portlanders. And all of his wounds were healed. And so we're going to go out and we're going to tell this story. And as a matter of fact, we're going to go to London next year and tell this story. And why London? Because in London, where in recent years they've had so many issues with radical Islamic terrorists putting bombs off in subways, they're having some of those same issues, right? A few people are affecting what people think about an entire people. And so what if we were to go to London and we were to tell this story? And what if out of this storytelling, they were to build an Islamic or a Persian garden that was not connected to a mosque? And instead of through media and doctrine, people came to know the Muslim people in a different way through culture, art, and nature. Couldn't you, in fact, begin to change attitudes of the people in London about the Muslim people, just as we changed attitudes about the Japanese here in Portland? And so this will all be part of the International Exchange Forum, which we're going on the road to tell this story, to find ways to make this relatable to other communities around the world. And so we've begun some of these seminars and symposiums with speakers, with politicians, and I just have to wrap up. I'm happy to say that in the darkest days of the pandemic in December, I stumbled across this campus in Portland, and we launched a $20 million capital campaign in December, of which we've raised about $13 million to purchase this campus to be the home of the Japan Institute and to house all of our training programs, the Global Center for Culture, Art, and the International Exchange Forum. We have an administration building which will house a music and and recording studio, a culinary studio, a wood and metal craft studio, a art studio, a ceramics studio, as well as a design and resource center for Japanese gardeners and architects. It has a residence hall, 22-bedroom residence hall, so that when you come to Portland, you don't have to put yourself up at a hotel. You will stay in our residence hall, and you will eat, sleep, and live with your faculty for 2 weeks at a time instead of all dispersing at night or when the class is over. It completely will change the educational paradigm. And it has a school building, which will have an auditorium as well. 3 miles from the Portland Japanese Garden, and from Washington Park to the Forest Park Trail System, you can walk in 1 hour from one campus to the other. And it's completely surrounded and contained by Forest Park, just as the Portland Japanese Garden is completely contained by Washington Park. And so all of this is in the name of collaboration and how important that is. And so we welcome you. The new campus will be open sometime in 2023. We've got about $9 million worth of renovations to do it, but exciting things to come. Thank you all very much.
Greetings from Cranbrook in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. My name is Greg Wittkopp, and I have the pleasure of directing the program area that is responsible for stewarding and sharing the history of Cranbrook, the Center for Collections and Research. The Cranbrook Japanese Garden is among the oldest surviving Japanese-style gardens in North America. Created in 1915, this 1-acre garden is part of the original country estate of Cranbrook's founders, newspaper publishers George Booth and Ellen Scripps Booth. The story that I will tell today focuses on the rehabilitation of one small corner of the garden, the Lily Pond Cascade. It was a collaborative project, one that was grounded with the advice of an historian, Dr. Kendall Brown, and culminated with a forward-looking design by Sadafumi Uchiyama that situates the Lily Pond Cascade within the framework of his master plan for the entire garden. In between, the project was realized through the work of an advisory group, the Consulate General of Japan in Detroit, and 3 Consul Generals, the Japanese Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport, and Tourism, the Venerable Master Gardener, Hiromo Terashita, a team of gardeners from the Japanese Federation of Landscape Contractors, and the diligent work of our gardener and aesthetic pruner, Emily Frankowiak. But first, the garden's context and history. In the 1920s, as George Booth retired from the active management of the family's newspapers, the Booths began to transform their estate into an eclectic group of educational and cultural institutions, known today as Cranbrook Educational Community. Located in suburban Detroit, Cranbrook's 300-acre campus comprises a K-12 school system, a graduate art school, a contemporary art museum, a science museum, and a history center that includes 3 historic house museums and the community's archive. With buildings designed by Albert Kahn, Eliel Saarinen, Frank Lloyd Wright, Todd Williams and Billy Chen, Stephen Hall, and Raphael Moneo, as well as landscapes designed by the Olmsted brothers, Thomas Dulliver Church and Dan Kiley. The campus, which is a National Historic Landmark District, is a veritable who's who of modern and contemporary design. Cranbrook's Japanese Garden is located on the edge of Kingswood Lake, originally called Glastonbury Lake, the campus's central water feature, midway between the founders' Tudoresque Arts and Crafts Manor home, designed by Albert Kahn in 1908, and the original Kingswood School for Girls, designed by Eliel Saarinen in 1931. The Japanese Garden, through which the waters of the Rouge River flow, began quite humbly as a rock garden and lily pond. This earliest configuration of the garden, which was planned in 1912 by George Booth and his father, is delineated on a 1914 appraisal map with many of the garden's current features in place. These include a dam, the Japanese-style bridge, which sits atop a second dam, the garden's 2 islands and 2 cascades. including the larger one that the Booths named the Lily Pond Cascade. What was the impetus for the creation of a Japanese garden at Cranbrook in the mid-1910s? Although the Booths had grand plans for the property they purchased in 1904, eventually realizing a series of terraced flower gardens, waterfalls and cascades, a Greek theater, and an Italian-style boathouse, there were no precedents in the Detroit area for incorporating a Japanese garden as part of the landscape of a country home. Unlike many of their wealthy peers, the Booths had not visited Japan, although they were world travelers. While there are many intriguing possibilities, including the nearby presence of Detroit industrialist Charles Lang Freer, who by 1915 had donated his Pan-Asian collection to the Smithsonian for the creation of the Freer Gallery of Art, the most common telling of this story begins in California. In the winter of 1915, George and Ellen Booth, then in their early 50s, traveled with George's father to see both the Panama California Exposition in San Diego and the Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco. In San Francisco, Booth purchased a set of 3 bronze storks from the S&G Gump Company. After placing them in the garden, he wrote to his youngest son, "We have our 3 bronze storks down in the rock garden, and they give the place more of a Japanese look." A few months later, in December 1915, George Booth contacted Yokohama Nursery, whose display he would have seen at the Panama Pacific Exposition, and bought a Japanese Kasuga-styled stone lantern and several large Japanese specimen plants, including a wisteria and a Japanese umbrella pine. Most likely working with Cranbrook's head gardener, a Scotsman, and Cranbrook's first landscaper, an Englishman, the Booths shaped the beginnings of a garden that George Booth's father, pictured here, immediately named Cranbrook's Japanese Garden. Over the course of the next 2 decades, the Booths continued to define the Japanese garden, settling on a non-traditional Japanese aesthetic that was characterized by an exuberance of mixed evergreen and deciduous plantings. If there is a precedent in Japan for this garden in Michigan, especially as it appeared during the initial decade of its creation, it was the naturalism embraced in the late 19th century by Japanese writers and eventually given form in the landscapes of the designer known as Uiji. The simple rustic quality of the meadows with patches of wildflowers depicted in early 20th century photographs of Uiji's second garden for Yamagata Aritomo in Kyoto are mirrored in the naturalism of Cranbrook's garden. Indeed, there is more than a passing similarity among photographs of the Cranbrook Japanese garden in the late 1920s, vintage photographs of Uiji's garden in the late 1910s, and the watercolors by Walter Tyndale that illustrate Japanese gardens, the 1912 book by Harriet Osgood Taylor, a copy of which Booth had bought for his library. In the 1930s, the garden became increasingly park-like. Pathways were removed and dense areas of trees and shrubs were replaced with grass lawns. The goal seems to have been to open vistas from the garden to Kingswood, Eliel Saarinen's new school for girls. If there is a precedent for the garden during this second phase of the Booth era, especially in the United States, it was a Japanese garden such as the one at Yadamas, the estate built in New Jersey by the pharmaceutical scion Charles Pfeiffer Jr. Indeed, Booth admired this garden enough to include it in his inspiration book, an oversized volume in which he pasted pictures of homes and gardens he admired, including 4 images of Japanese gardens. These images clearly influence Booth's work at Cranbrook, where there are many instances of direct relationships between images in the scrapbook and the estate's buildings and grounds. There is a striking similarity between the lawns and the treatment of the pond edges in the Japanese gardens at both Cranbrook and Yadamas, with their smooth boulders and lack of plant material along the banks. Although it is unlikely that Booth visited Yadamas, perhaps he was inspired by watching Mary Pickford's starring role in Madame Butterfly, a 1915 and now problematic silent film partially set in Pfizer's Japanese garden. With the passing of George and Ellen Booth in the late 1940s, the garden, which during World War II came to be known as the Oriental Garden, became overgrown, necessitating its rediscovery in the early 1970s. The garden's first renewal was undertaken by a newly formed volunteer group, the Cranbrook Gardens Auxiliary, an effort that continued 2 decades later in 1995 when they implemented a substantial redesign of the garden. Despite the best efforts of this committed group of volunteers, this garden on the banks of the Rouge River proved difficult to tame. Periodic flooding of the river and its watershed did not help. In 2016, Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research took on the responsibility for thinking strategically about the garden's future. Established in 2012, the center is responsible for sustaining and interpreting Cranbrook's landscapes, architecture, collections, and archives. As the center began to develop its mission and public programs, my staff and I quickly realized that many of Cranbrook's original landscapes were vulnerable to decline, the result of changes in taste and reduced budgets. It soon became clear that one of the center's first major undertakings needed to be an examination of the Japanese garden. The first step was a period of education for Cranbrook, including its staff, volunteers, and visitors. Dr. Kendall Brown delivered a lecture at Cranbrook in April 2016 titled Cranbrook's Japanese Garden in Context, Japanese-Style Landscapes in America, Then and Now. To a packed audience, including Michigan's Japanese Consul General, the center announced its ambitious aspiration to revitalize the garden and ensure its future for the next generation. In rapid order that same year, the center successfully led the charge to change the name of the Oriental Garden back to its original name. Inserted the Japanese garden and the center's goal to rejuvenate it into the final section of a new campus-wide master plan, oversaw the restoration of the Japanese bridge, formed the Cranbrook Japanese Garden Advisory Group, and traveled with the group to New York to study the Japanese garden at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, a Japanese-style garden that also opened in 1915, the same year the Booth began to shape Cranbrook's Japanese garden. Although the center had quickly demonstrated the seriousness of its intent, it needed a plan. In the summer of 2017, we commissioned Quinn Evans Architects to research and write a formal historic landscape study, one that would respect the fact that the Cranbrook Japanese Garden is part of a larger National Historic Landmark District. To support the work of Quinn Evans, we also commissioned a detailed topographical survey of the garden's 1-acre site. The National Park Service and the U.S. Department of the Interior, which oversee National Historic Landmarks like Cranbrook, offer 4 distinct approaches for the treatment of historic properties and cultural landscapes: preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. With a garden that has evolved over a period of more than 100 years, an evolution that sometimes took well-intentioned yet illogical turns, preservation of the existing garden did not make sense. Restoration and reconstruction also were problematic approaches, as no one moment sufficiently defined the garden as a Japanese-style garden. Building on a conversation we had with Dr. Brown during his visit in 2016 and the research documented in the historic landscape study, we settled on a strategy for the rehabilitation of the garden. The Secretary of the Interior's guidelines encouraged this approach when there is, quote, the need to alter or add to a cultural landscape to meet continuing new uses while retaining the landscape historic character, end quote. In essence, we decided to undertake a project that would rehabilitate and complete the work the booth started in 1915, but never finished. With a strategy now in mind, we initiated a series of conversations with designers that could work with Cranbrook to develop a rehabilitation master plan. The advisory group established a series of 5 criteria that the designer needed to possess. The designer would have 1, experience designing Japanese gardens of national significance. 2, experience working on the restoration and revitalization of an historic Japanese garden. 3, experience designing public gardens, including the inclusion of accessibility best practices. 4, recognition within the Japanese American community. And perhaps most important, 5, respect for the history and unique potential of the garden at Cranbrook. We invited 3 well-known designers to Cranbrook in May 2018, asking them to present a public lecture and have an informal conversation with the advisory group in the garden. Although all three presented impressive portfolios and offered thoughtful ideas about Cranbrook's garden, it was Sadafumi Uchiyama that captured our imagination with his palpable respect for both the booth legacy and his passion for the project. Following subsequent conversations with him later that month, during a workshop co-hosted by NAJGA and Cranbrook in Michigan, we ultimately commissioned Uchiyama to develop our master plan. The central feature of the Cranbrook Japanese garden is the lily pond, which is fed by 3 sources of water: a crashing waterfall fed by the Kingswood Lake, the flowing water cascade, which is fed by a natural artesian well, and the lily pond cascade. Although it is one of the character-defining features of the Japanese garden, the lily pond cascade, like the rest of the garden, needed work. Water over the cascades had slowed to a trickle, and the area was choked with Japanese butterbur. An opportunity to rehabilitate the cascade came in 2017 when Consul General Wada and the staff of the Consulate General of Japan in Detroit offered to write a grant on behalf of the Cranbrook Center and submit it for consideration to the Japanese Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport, and Tourism. The grant was part of the ministry's Japanese Garden Overseas Restoration Project. Started in 2017, the initial aim of the program was to help restore 50 Japanese-style gardens outside of Japan in 5 years. While the timing was not ideal, Uchiyama had not even been interviewed, let alone commissioned to develop a master plan. We realized it was an opportunity that we had to seize. News of the success of the grant arrived in April of 2018. Fortunately, the planning meeting with representatives of the ministry and the Japanese Federation of Landscape Contractors could be delayed for a few months. This gave the center time to continue its conversations with the 3 potential designers and even have preliminary conversations with Uchiyama about the development of a master plan. This was important, as Uchiyama ultimately played a critical role in the rehabilitation of the Lily Pond Cascade, serving as Cranbrook's representative on the project and ensuring the work would complement his developing vision for the master plan. During the next 2 months, Master Gardener Hiromo Tirashita, who the ministry selected to lead the Lily Pond Cascade project, developed a more detailed proposal and sent preliminary sketches and plant lists from Japan to Cranbrook and Uchiyama. Uchiyama not only participated in the summer planning meeting at Cranbrook, but also returned to Cranbrook for 2 days in September to visit stone yards and nurseries and select the stones and plants that Cranbrook ordered for the project. The actual garden work took place over the course of just 6 days at the beginning of October 2018. Terashita and 5 gardeners from the Japanese Federation of Landscape Contractors were joined by Uchiyama, Ryuichi Wakisaka, who was representing the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport, and Tourism, and Yuka Ito, who is representing the Organization for Landscape and Urban Green Infrastructure in Japan. The formal dedication of the Lily Pond Cascade took place at the end of the 6-day project and was followed by a celebratory dinner hosted by Consul General Wada at his official residence less than a mile from the garden in Bloomfield Hills. The center unveiled Uchiyama's master plan a year later, in October 2019, during a public program that included a presentation by Uchiyama, garden tours, and a dinner that included the subsequent Japanese Consul General as a guest of honor. The plan respects the integrity and historical features of the Booth-era landscape, while also enhancing its significance as a Japanese-style garden. Highlights include a new entrance garden and gazebo, a new viewing pavilion, and enhanced cascades. When complete, the garden will be accessible with new ramped paths and wooden bridges along the edge of the pond. As we worked on the Lily Pond Cascade, Uchiyama offered me some sage advice. If you do a good job with the rehabilitation of the Cascade, he counseled, your patrons will be behind you as you raise funds for each of the subsequent phases of the master plan. The center is now developing a funding plan and identifying patrons for the next phase of the rehabilitation, the new entrance garden. Everything was on track. That is until a pandemic and climate change intervened. In January 2020, a freakish winter downpour caused rain to run off the frozen surface of Kingswood Lake and overflow its banks into the garden. This summer, no fewer than 4 more downpours, the likes of which had not been seen for at least 20 years, each caused the lake to again overflow its banks. While the damage to plants was minimal, the erosion to the pathways was substantial. Although nature likes to exert its power, the Cranbrook Japanese Garden is resilient. Last month, Uchiyama returned to Cranbrook to help us jumpstart the master plan again through a series of conversations with Cranbrook staff, our gardener, Emily Frankowiak, potential landscape contractors, numerous patrons and sponsors, and the third Consul General to work with us on the project, Consul General Shindo. By this spring, we hope to have made substantial progress on securing the funds it will take to implement the new entrance garden and establish an endowment for its maintenance. Our goal is to ensure that the Cranbrook Japanese Garden will remain a place of beauty and inspiration for yet another generation of students and visitors. It was a pleasure to share with you the history of the Cranbrook Japanese Garden, the rehabilitation of the Lily Pond Cascade, and our plans and vision for the garden's future. If you would like to learn more, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really thrilled to be here with my new friend and colleague now, Stephen Bloom, especially who I got a chance to meet a couple months ago in New York. And just for a second to plug a program that Japan Society and Portland Japanese Garden is hosting online and available to everybody for free. It's called the Living Traditions Series. And it's been really exciting to work with Aki and with his team to present a video series about all of the wonderful legacy and history Japanese culture that we know of today that's still alive with us. And the first one was on gardens, so I hope everybody goes to YouTube and checks it out. First, I'll explain a little bit about why I'm here today. I'm not a researcher about the gardens and how they were used in terms of care after the tsunami. I was programming it based in northeastern Japan after the triple disaster that you probably remember from 2011. And this interesting thing as I'm hearing my colleagues speak is they're not Japanese gardens as much as they're gardens in Japan that we were doing. So bear with me while I talk through a little bit of what we did in terms of gardens in Japan as a form of healing after the disaster. Okay. So many of you maybe know this quote by Nelson Mandela, but it was kind of a guiding light for me during this process. A garden was one of the few things in prison that you could control. To plant a seed, watch it grow, to tend it and then harvest it, offered a simple but enduring satisfaction. The sense of being the custodian of this small patch of earth offered a small taste of freedom. And I was thinking about that quote quite a bit after the triple disaster, where people lost their old family homes in this rural area. And gardens and gardening was a big part of their country rural life. But now they were in these very small, cramped boxes, waiting for the rebuilding of their communities. And the experience of the daily routine of going and gardening and picking onions and all of the bonsai that washed away, now you're in this box waiting. And I was thinking about how garden programs are used in prisons, it's therapy. I was thinking about how gardens are used to treat veterans with PTSD returning home. I was thinking about my own mother who has battled depression and how much her garden means to her every morning when she goes out with her cup of coffee to see what has bloomed and what has changed. I know that I'm preaching to the choir on this one, but the power of how gardens heal oneself is significant. Combined with natural disasters cause significant psychological and social suffering to affected populations, protecting and improving people's well-being is a priority. So this daily experience of gardening in terms of daily healing, and how could that be harnessed after a major disaster to heal the people who survived, were at the forefront of my mind. Just to review in terms of scale of what we were dealing with, I was the country director for a medical and disaster outreach organization called AmeriCares. It's based in Connecticut. And they were very familiar with doing disaster relief after earthquakes in Haiti, for example. But the Japanese situation was particular. It was big. It was bigger than anybody could dream of. A 9.0 earthquake and a tsunami that went up to 40 meters high in some places. And to put that into perspective, that's a 12-story building. And it inundated 560 kilometers of coastline, so basically California. It was the costliest in terms of financial terms natural disaster in the world. 235 in world history, $235 billion of damage and 22,000 lives lost. Despite the thousands of people who passed in that disaster, many survived. And they all needed new homes because their towns, their post offices, their homes were wiped away. So how do you take care of the survivors? And that was when I was considering the particular challenges that they were facing and how best to help them. And AmeriCares, we received the generous funding of $9 million. Compared to other organizations, it was a fraction and a fraction of what was needed to heal. But I believed that psychosocial programming to deal with grief, loneliness, depression, anxiety was probably one of the best ways that we can use that funding. And so I got to partner, speaking of collaboration, with local groups in northeastern Japan about how best to heal people. And the thing about northeastern Japan, and in addition to it being rural, it has a very large elderly population. So there were demographics that we had to consider. And when we think sometimes of Japan, some of you will know Tokyo and these small little apartments that people are used to living in. But out in the countryside in this area, the houses are quite large and they home several generations. So people were very unused to living in these very cramped spaces, and they were depressed and literally not getting out of bed. And one of the issues that we were confronting was disuse syndrome. Basically, you're not moving and your muscles and your tendons just start decaying. Of course, higher blood pressure, depression, anxiety, loneliness, hopelessness, huge spikes in alcoholism, and arthritis, sleeplessness. How do we fix these things? Well, it seemed like gardens might be a way that would make sense to people. This was very early after the disaster. You can see that the foundations of this home was left, and somebody had come and planted a garden in the foundation of their home. And this was one of the first photos that I took that inspired me that we needed a program to support this kind of effort. And there was nothing more kind of inspiring, heart-wrenching, and hopeful than the person who went back to their home and used that dirt to grow food. What we accomplished at the end of this effort of putting together people, just to give you some data of what we were able to do. It took a lot of volunteers to do because of the dirt moving and hoeing and getting rid of rubble and all of that stuff, particularly for the elderly who weren't able to do that. So we organized 900 volunteers. They planted 132 individual gardens, like what we just saw in the foundation of some people's homes, and also community gardens. And that one group called Peace Boat that had been doing disaster relief was able to help 310 people directly and 1,700 indirectly by way of benefiting from those gardens. Many of these gardens, by the way, still exist. And then we worked with other groups that had been doing disaster relief in the area. Some we did with horticultural therapy, some we did with community gardens. And together we worked with 864 people. Some were experienced gardeners before the disaster, some never had it before in their life and discovered gardening as a way to get through the disaster. And ultimately we landed with 200 individual gardens, most of them for vegetables, some of them for flowers, and 6 community gardens. And what did we find out? The healing benefits. This is a woman who we met in Ishinomaki. We're doing the big kind of dirt layout for her. And she's helping with that. She lost her business, she lost her dog, she lost her home in the disaster. She didn't lose any direct family members, so she was one of the easier people, survivors that we worked with, but still she was dealing with depression. On the emotional well-being, the feeling of anticipation and something to look forward to was really motivating for people. We wanted them to get out of bed to combat the disuse syndrome, to combat depression. We needed them to get up out of their box and go outside again, just a few steps a day. And I think everybody knows here who has ever grown tomatoes, there's nothing more exciting than going and seeing if your tomato has ripened. You have to water, you have to tend, you have to get out of bed and go take care of your garden and see what changed overnight. So it brought back feelings of anticipation and initiative. It was mentally and physically engaging, of course. And it also restored kind of a normalcy of and place. And for many people, it was made them friends with nature again. You know, the tsunami was this ultimate betrayal by nature and took away everything. And coming to peace with nature again and what it can give back to you, I think brought a lot of spiritual well-being to people. For those who hadn't done gardening before, they learned new skills and knowledge. After a few years, we had a few master gardeners that just got really into it and started importing heirloom seeds from all over the world and very expert in all of these things. There are opportunities for interaction. If you're out there in your garden, people walking by with their dogs stop and talk to you. Of course, the community gardens allowed people who had been fragmented from their original communities to make new friends. We also saw a resurgence in indigenous bees. The gardens that we supported, as you can imagine, only used organic fertilizer and soil, and no pesticides are allowed, no herbicides are allowed in the gardens, at least that we would fund. And we saw a resurgence of birds and butterflies and bees. And for people who are living in a disaster zone with only access to small corner stores with chips and crackers, and while the grocery stores were still being built out, they had access to fresh food, fresh vegetables that they didn't have for quite some time after the disaster. We learned a few things about gender. Men, the fathers and the grandfathers wanted to do things in the garden, but it was kind of their wives' work with the vegetable gardens in the past for some of them. So we were trying to figure out, well, how do we get the guys out here? And so we started doing building projects around the gardens, little rest areas, bird houses, and the woodworking brought out the men, and they started interacting with their wives more. And one woman told me that she had a new ritual with her husband that she had never had before the disaster, where before dinner every night they would go out to the garden together and see what had changed and just kind of look at things. So this gentleman said, I feel like I'm in a prison at my temporary house. The low ceiling and small window drives me crazy. Having a garden to work in makes me feel sane again, like a human being. More quotes from people who participated. Here in the photo, you're going to see that we did raised beds, and that was in Fukushima. Needless to say, we couldn't plant in the soil in Fukushima. We had to bring in the soil and we had to build planters so people felt safe, particularly with their kids going and eating the food and being outside. So when you see a planter in this situation, that was the effort we did in Fukushima. What do I enjoy most? Waiting for the harvest. I wonder how the seeds did overnight. I think about what I'll plant next. I didn't used to think about tomorrow. I do now. We went out mornings and evenings to water and to fertilize the soil. We have to go every day. Even if we don't feel like it, we have to go and check in on the plants. That we have to go is something. If we didn't have that, we wouldn't go out at all. We'd just watch television. And this was our goal. This was what we wanted, how to get people out of their beds. Now, for recommendations in terms of other disasters, post-disasters, you need partnerships with local groups. It does take manpower. That's Minsuk from Hope Worldwide Japan that was out there every day with people doing flower projects, etc. You need people on the ground. Often people who have done disaster relief and volunteers, they don't know how to do psychosocial care. They're not trained in it, but gardening projects is something that they can dig into. Location, of course, is important. Materials, gender considerations. Sometimes women just want to hang out with the ladies, and sometimes the guys just want to hang out with the guys. So you have to make sure that the environment created allows for safety for both. Seasons. It gets really cold in Northeast Japan, so you had to go inside and do some events around the garden, even when the garden wasn't in bloom. On the left is one of our winter a garden participant, but in the winter we would go inside and do crafts around gardening and roses and making decorations for their homes. And then on the right was my Iwate garden ladies who's would make big seasonal food events around the garden when it was too cold to actually do the garden and the ground was frozen. So these were chilies from the summer that they were making chili powder from. So planning for seasons outside of the garden season was really important to create continuity and stability. And I'll close here. I know that I think we're going a little bit long, so I just want to, I'll end here very quickly. That's me in the middle. This was in Fukushima, and after we built this little rest area where people could go and look at each other's crops and enjoy and talk and chat and have a little gathering area that was so important for making new friends while living in temporary housing. So to just close out today, collaboration was key to this, but what I can say most of all, it's one of the proudest moments of my life to have participated in this and to meet somebody who in 1 week would be just dark and cloudy and hopeless, and literally a few weeks later they're tilling soil, and a month later they're looking at the buds of their plants, and the hope and the joy and the excitement you can read in somebody's face, and it was a magic pill that we were looking for to give people a little bit of hope, and it inspired tremendous faith in how gardens heal. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Ramona. Good morning, everybody. It's really exciting to be here to talk to you about what I think is really at the heart of every garden, which is our educational and cultural programming. So I'm just going to try to get access here. As Larry was saying, I had the great pleasure of being the senior director at the Earl Burns Miller Japanese Garden. It's a small garden. I'd like you to keep that in mind as I make my presentation. So it's a small staff, but on a university campus. So it affects the way we do our programming. And our programming in both education and cultural public programming is really connected to our feeling that Japanese gardens as art forms are artful spaces that inspire creativity in all of us. From 2 to 92 is kind of our motto when we were creating programming at the garden. But we also were keenly aware, because our university had a significant College of the Arts, that artists themselves were deeply touched by the Japanese garden and inspired by them. So history tells us that traditional arts in Japanese gardens really flourished over a large number of years in history: music, dance, costume, poetry, fine dining, theatrical performances, crafts, and amusements. And I think these scenes and our knowledge of the arts in history of Japanese gardens encouraged all of us to develop cultural programs and put on performances. We actually had a stage built for our garden so that we could put on stage productions. We did all kinds of things, including kabuki and various performances. We did a fashion show based on the tale of Genji, and a professor from Japan brought a troupe of 13 people that had all the costumes from the age, and we did vignettes. But we also did other kinds of programming. We did opera in the garden, vignettes, a Madama Butterfly. And we really tried to engage with the arts community in Long Beach and at the university. And as I said, because we're a university, we had these multiple objectives. We had an internal audience and we had our community constituents. And really, the university was supportive of us bringing these two constituencies together. And cultural programming, arts programming was really an effective way to do that. So in recent years, recent decades, we're seeing the contemporary arts play a greater role in Japanese gardens, not just here in the United States, like this Chihuly exhibit at the Denver Japanese garden in their koi pond, but when we installed our lighting system in the garden, I worked with a Japanese firm, and they were telling me all the really contemporary things that were going on in Japanese gardens, and that was in the 1990s. So it inspired us to really think about contemporary arts and contemporary artists in the garden. This is just another example of things that are going on in Japanese gardens in the United States today. So my presentation is really going to be about a program called Garden Me. And give me a minute here because I am a long talker and I wanted to time myself. So Garden Me was billed as a light, dance, and sound experience. And I want to give credit to Allison Redfoot, our recently retired assistant director, for pulling these images together, mostly off of her iPhone, because the link to the quite nice video that we had from this performance seems to be lost in space at the moment. So on the tables, you have just a copy of what the invitation looked like. And I think the cover picture gives you a sense for some of the drama and beauty of this program. There featured dance and music by local artists, by university professors and students, garden staff, and volunteers. The three people here are our key collaborators, really echoing what Steve Bloom said about collaborative ventures in the arts at gardens and how successful they are, and actually once you get into it, how natural they are. We were lucky to be working with Professor Martin Herman in the middle. He was the chair of the design department at the university. He was also at the time the director of the Cole Conservatory of Music on our campus. I found Martin in the garden one day, which wasn't unusual, and he was paying close attention to the waterfall. As a musician and a composer, the water sounds were really intriguing him. So I interrupted his reverie to say hello, and we started talking about the sounds of the garden, and he said, you know, I have a friend who's a composer from Czechoslovakia, and he's just starting to showcase a composition called Garden Me. And his name was Vit Zahauer, and long story short, Vit agreed to let us premiere his composition Garden Me on campus as part of our program. And I think after the second year, we did this program 3 years. After the first performance was over, we also attracted the artist who shows up on your right, Nick Venden. Nick had a background in Broadway productions. He was an installation artist, a director, and a very creative soul. So these formed the core of our creative team. And over 3 years, we produced Garden Me. It started out quite simply. We featured Vit's composition, Garden Me, which, by the way, was electronic music. And so he gathered up sounds in his own garden. He ran them through his computers that generate music, composed this beautiful piece. When we premiered it, Professor Herman said, of course, his laptop ensemble. So get this, students who take courses in producing music on their laptops would come to the garden. And we had quite an extensive sound system, surround sound system. And they would not only play Garden Me composition, but at the end of it, they would each pick up garden sounds and extemporaneously riff pieces. So that imagine the students around the garden playing. It was fascinating. We also included students who played Tibetan singing bowls who were also positioned around the garden. This program, if you look at the thing I left on the table and you open it up, it's a little map of our garden, and it shows that as a participant or as the audience, you didn't sit stationary. You came to the garden and you strolled around, and as you strolled around, you encountered dancers, musicians, art installations, some of them interactive. So this is a few pictures of people in preparation. Costumes got to be rather extensive by the third year, really beautiful pieces. And the dance troupe grew. It started out with the younger dancer in this picture, who was a recent graduate of our dance program, who had her own dance studio. She eventually recruited some of her mentors and her students into the production. These are some of our volunteers who got involved in all kinds of things, adjusting costumes and supporting the installation of the art pieces and just preparing the garden for the event. They did all kinds of things. Luckily, as I said, we have a lot of student assistants who work for us, interns. We had about 30 interns every semester and other volunteers, because you have to keep the garden going while you prepare for an event like this. And it's nice to have students with nimble backs and knees to do what has to be done. Here's just some more pictures of the setup, and I'm over there sort of trying to hand somebody something there. It's a piece of sculpture that's going to hang off of a trellis, and I can't tell you how thankful I am that students are doing that, and that me and my older volunteers are up there doing that. So this is the just a replica of the invitation, very straightforward. But what I wanted to show you is the list of artists and collaborators. This was, I think, third year. And also take a look at that map, because remember, it's an encounter experience. It's not a stage performance. So now we're just going to have a little peek of the event itself. I'm going to go through this quickly. So the event took place on the night of the spring equinox under a beautiful moon. We tried to keep the rest of the lighting very subtle. This is a close-up of an art installation, a piece of ice with pebbles embedded in it. That as this piece thawed, it released the pebbles. And we set it up so that people could, with their breath, could release the pebbles. And this became one of the more popular because it's interactive, because it relates to the theme of spring and the thaw of winter, quite dramatically lit in one part of the garden. Images of dragonflies and other images sort of softly showing on the pathways. This is a picture of a piece that's in the garden all the time. It's part of the pathway, and it has the phoenix birds. This inspired an installation where Nick worked with a friend who was a sculptor, and they built a a sculpture, and then this is the nest for the phoenix bird that was put together by people visiting the garden prior to the event. We had materials and a little sign, and we invited people to help create a nest out of these garden materials. A picture at night, just before the performance. This is the phoenix bird in the trees. If you look closely, you can see how it was suspended from the birch trees. There was a rope attached to it, so people could pull on the rope. It would activate the sculpture, which made these interesting sounds. Well, this particular year, we moved the Tibetan singing bowls into the tea house where one of the students performed. Now, this is very unusual. Imagine going into a tent that's blacked out. You've got white sparkly sand on the floor and a very high definition projection of a Bodhisattva, the Kannon image, on the sand. And the idea is that you can manipulate the image with sculpting tools or just with your hand by moving the sand around.
What they've done is projected the image down onto salt and glitter.
One of our board members is speaking there. She's a woman that came reluctantly to arts programming, but she was so engaged with Garden Me that she became one of the facilitators. This is just a couple of pictures. Our moon bridge was decorated and became really a central part because in the last iteration of Garden Me, there was a play, and this is where one of the major scenes of the play happened, and the mask was part of that little episode of the play. And so the play moved around. First it started over here, then there was a scene over there, then a scene over here. And so once again, it didn't make any difference where the audience was. We staged it so that they were in 360, and the actors moved past them and then hit their spot and then did that scene. It was really engaging. So sounds of the waterfall, I explained how that kind of played a role. And then again, with these high definition projectors, they projected images. One year it was the koi climbing up the waterfall. This year it was dragons. The artist got very interested in the iconology of dragons. And these are just some pictures of the ice installations. And some of them were interactive, so you can see we invited the audience to pour warm water over these enormous blocks of ice. Our cherry blossoms were blooming at the time, and so they'd embedded the blossoms in the ice, and as audience poured the warm water, then the cherry blossoms were released. Okay, so this is several hundred ping pong balls in the koi pond that allowed us to project images onto the water. At first we thought we were just going to project onto the water, but the light just goes right through. So then we realized we needed to put something in the water so that then the images could be projected. And that's the moon, and then the image sort of mirroring it, and then you're going to hear some people talking, and it got picked up on this
So they were
video.
both controlling LED strips with different colors?
Oh, I don't know why it skipped. But anyway, here we go. This was a snippet of one of the dance pieces, and we have a shakuhachi player. All of a sudden, the animations are not working. Oh, well. Okay, so that it gives you a little bit of an idea of how the garden felt, how it looked on that night. These are some shots that I'm not sure how to get the animation piece to work. Are you able to help me out here? There we go. And then this is a piece installed in one of our pathways that allowed anybody going down that pathway to step on these pads. And as you step on them, you bring up lights and sounds. So there's actually some frogs embedded in that piece of sound that you could bring up by stepping on the lights. That was really fun. And after the performance, we invited people back into our event pavilion where they had a chance to hear from the performers themselves about what their inspiration was and answer questions and really receive acknowledgement, because this was a program that everybody contributed to and worked hard to make successful. And we served tea, hot tea and cookies, and on the spring equinox, even in Long Beach, it could be very cool and a little damp, and everybody loved the tea. They loved the chance to talk to the artist and to the students, and it was a wonderful outcome. So what we took away from Garden Me is that by collaborating with local artists and creative people, bringing them into the process, letting them co-create with you. And they all were very attracted to the garden, some of them not very knowledgeable about gardens or even Japanese culture, but they learned, we learned, and we attracted new audiences. I think we suffer a little bit because people go, oh, Japanese garden, oh, I went there once, check it off the list, been there, done that. So the programming always has to be new and fresh. And while our traditional programming always attracted large audiences, they were people who already had a developed taste for Japanese gardens and Japanese culture. Contemporary programs attracts a different group. And once they get there, they fall in love with the garden. It's like, oh my God, I didn't know you did these kinds of things. And it just makes it relevant and welcoming. So these would be the things I would suggest, is that in your programming, you identify a group of collaborators that have time, talent, or treasure. If you can get all three, that's great, trifecta. Consider new programming and initiatives through pilot programs. Start small, build each year. These will give you some images, some experience in order to seek funding and to show, proof of life. We can actually do this. It isn't just pie in the sky. And incorporate the networks of the new people that come in. Every person that comes in has a whole nother network. And so you want to activate those networks and do allow time and space for innovation. Innovation takes time. It takes patience, creativity, but you know how it is. When you share something like this, you really bond with people and they bond with you. So in conclusion, until Garden Me, we were unaware of them, many of the artists in our own community, and they were unaware of us. But Garden Me brought us all together. Thank you.
So today I'm going to speak a little bit about some of our wellness programming at Anderson Japanese Gardens. So as all of you experienced in 2020, we didn't have events any longer. And as you saw from Jeanette's program, some of our events included music in the garden, some really large scale events. So we went to 0 events in 2020, just really focusing on the garden itself, but also realizing that some wellness programming was going to be needed. Like, we all felt the effects of 2020. We could see it in the students, within our own children, within our community. So that's really what prompted us to move in this direction. So there were basically 3 additions. One was considered mindful art. One was some awareness walks, and the third was a program called Path to Renewal. As we all know, nature is powerful. Studies are finally helping us define what we really already knew, right? You can feel healthier, stronger sense of well-being, lowers blood pressure, et cetera, reduces anxiety, improves mood, all those things that you feel when you're out in that space. And again, this inability to host large events in a traditional manner is what allowed us to refocus on the importance and connection between gardens and health. So mindful art was the making of art and nature. So art and nature are incredible tools for improving our overall wellness. Exposure to art and nature lowers stress, forges a connection between sort of this mind and body, and lifts emotions and reduces anxiety. We worked specifically with an art instructor, and we named it the Mindful Art Series, the Making of Art in Nature. Classes occurred once per week for 4 weeks under the pavilion. You could register for the entire set or just one at a time. Each week there was a new theme as well as a new way to create the art. There was a different medium. And then you moved into the garden once you were instructed, and you found this sort of quiet, reflective space, and you created your artwork. The instructor was always there on site to assist if you had any questions, but really it was a singular experience. Oops, wrong way. So there were 4 themes in the mindful art. One was awareness, and your medium was clay. That was the first week. The second week was patience. The medium was watercolors. The third week was balance. The medium was charcoal. And the last week was inner joy and peace, and the medium was colored pencils. So next we'll move on to our awareness walks, which I did bring a booklet if someone would like to look at it after this session. And the idea was there were 10 different suggested stops throughout the garden, really just answering some questions. Each stop had sensory prompts, and the stops could be done anytime, right? So whenever you wanted. The idea was also that it's sort of multi-generational, right? Something that you could bring and do with your young children. Like, like one of the spots was the lawn, and it was really like, what does the grass feel like on your feet, right? Everybody loves that feeling. And the program intention was really that life is just busy. So people come to the garden, but sometimes kind of forget how to really just slow down and enjoy what's around them. There's sort of these, let's post some things on Instagram, let's create some really great photos, maybe make a TikTok video, right? And so we really wanted to get people away from their phone and to really focus on engaging their senses. So at each stop, you're encouraged to pause, be mindful, use your senses and journal your experience. Again, using the sensory prompts, which you can see on the slide, where tea house is one of them. And again, a good way to forge connections with multi-generational ages. So the third program, Introduction, is really just in its early stages. Like the book actually just came from print maybe 3 weeks ago. So it was a long process of probably close to a year of creating the guide, but it's called A Path to Renewal, a guide to the healing and renewing potential of the gardens. So it's really a self-guided program to really help promote one's own physical, mental, and emotional health and overall sense of well-being. Okay, the goal is to offer a program utilizing the power of nature to community organizations, healthcare facilities, support groups, or anyone that may simply want a guide to help connect with nature and their inner self. So currently we're working with 3 organizations. One is a VETS program, the second is a hospice program, and the third is Family Peace Center, which is a center for domestic violence that just started in our area maybe 3 years ago. Each organization's received a journal and staff is just starting the program. So it really is in its initial phasing, but we've received some really positive responses. So there are 5 parts. Part 1 is really just orientation. Trying to, lay everything out, become familiar with the garden. Some people have never been to the garden, so although, it's telling you sort of, or guiding you in some of the guided walking portions at the end, where to go or, what to do, some people aren't familiar enough with the garden to be able to do this right away. So there's an orientation. Part 2 is reforming you. So it's really all about becoming aware of your thoughts and sort of the things that are going on in your life. Part 3 is how to really be mindful in nature. It talks about breathing, walking through the space, engaging your senses. Part 4 is a story. So kind of sort of a self-reflecting portion where you journal whatever it is you'd like to journal about your life, whether that be past or present or even what your goals are in the future. And then part 5, which is the lengthiest portion of the book, is 10 guided walks. Again, sort of clumping it together, parts 1 through 3, information and practices that enhance your experience and help you gain the maximum benefit from connecting with nature. Part 4 gives you the opportunity to write about your life. And then part 5, of course, are these guided theme walks, such as living in awareness, finding inner peace, seeing beauty, experiencing freedom, embracing change. And you can move through the book any way you'd like. Okay, so you can jump around, obviously. You can address one theme per visit, or, maybe you don't have enough time for that, and use it as you see fit. So thank you.
Hello, my name is Emmy Yoshimura, and I'm the Director of Education at Descanso Gardens. I'm happy to be with you today to talk about creativity and innovation in public programs in Japanese gardens. And I'm going to share some examples of when our programs have really tried to build connection and community. But before that, just a bit about Descanso Gardens. We are a botanical garden of about 150 acres located in La Cañada Flint Ridge, which is in the north part of Los Angeles County. Descanso Gardens is known for its collection of oaks, camellias, California native plants, roses, and also seasonal displays. The mission of the gardens is on the screen and can be summarized as saying that Descanso Gardens is a beautiful and unique landscape, and our job is to take care of it and share it with people in meaningful ways. So when we think about public programs at Descanso Gardens, we often think about this idea of what is hidden and how we can reveal it. There are so many stories about history and culture, design, beauty, and wellness that are in the gardens. If we can just kind of help people look closely, slow down, and make these connections. So we often think about that when we think about creating public programs. And I think some of the most meaningful public programs are when we are able to use those to help inspire us to understand our own history, to share stories in a variety of ways with visitors, and to build relationships. So today I'm going to share a bit about some examples of how we have used public programs to help understand our own history, specifically looking at a gallery exhibition we put on, how we've shared stories in a variety of ways, looking at interpretive signage, seasonal installations, and how we've built relationships and looking at some camellia and poetry programming that we have coming up. I've been at Descanso Gardens for about 8 years. And when I arrived, due to some thoughtful work by our former executive director, David Brown, and others, there was some nice interpretive information in this building that is on the screen. This is the Bodie House. It was built by the former owner of the property and had been used as kind of the interpretive center, a place for a lot of storytelling in the gardens. And some of this storytelling touched on the acquisition of camellias by Mr. Bodie during World War II from two Japanese nurserymen, Mr. Uematsu and Mr. Yoshimura. And this is a very interesting story. I was very impressed that this was part of the storytelling that happened at the garden, but there was some language in here that I always kind of felt a little bit curious and troubling. And it was that it said that Mr. Bodie paid a fair market price for the camellias he bought during this time. That really kind of stuck with me, and I had some conversations, and some other folks kind of thought, oh yeah, I don't know if that's true. And so I had that in my mind as something that'd be very interesting to look into more, learn more about, and really understand more of the detail and nuance in that transaction that happened that was so important to Descanso Gardens. And shortly thereafter, we realized that 2016 was going to be the 50th anniversary of our Japanese garden at Descanso Gardens. And we thought, what a wonderful opportunity to share and celebrate this very special and beloved part of our gardens. And what an opportunity to learn more about the different communities and people that were involved in creating this garden in particular. And lift up some of those voices. And so we started putting together an exhibition design team, which includes some faces that might be familiar to some of you. Naomi Hirahara, who is a historian and writer and reporter and editor, and has deep connections to the Japanese American gardening community in Los Angeles and Pasadena. And Dr. Kendall Brown, who I'm sure so many of you know through NAJGA and other related organizations, and he has been such a good resource to us and continues to be a help to Descanso Gardens, helping us understand our Japanese garden, the history of it, and placing it in context for us. So with these two folks on board, we went ahead and put together an exhibition that ended up being called Sharing Culture, Creating Community, and it was in our small gallery, the Stuart Haga Gallery, at the end of 2016 and into 2017. So a few images from the garden exhibition. So this was important to us because we have this lovely gallery at the gardens, which was intended to showcase a variety of exhibitions on a variety of topics related to the garden in one way or another, but it had really been used mostly for contemporary art exhibitions. So for us to use it for something that was about the history of our own garden was something new. And for us to kind of lead this design team and use this as a way to get more into our history was also something very, very exciting for us. So this is our kind of entrance gallery. It has a beautiful picture by Warren Marr. We had one gallery that talked about the community and some of the people that were involved in putting together the Japanese garden and really bringing it to life. We had a gallery that was featuring images by David Cobb and some other artwork that we commissioned, and talked about how gardens can be vehicles for communicating and transmitting ideas about culture, both across time and space. And then we also had a third gallery, which was about honoring the original spirit of creating our Japanese garden by displaying art inspired by Japanese gardens and commissioning new work. And this is one of our opening celebration activities. We invited a lot of community that was involved in the garden over the past 50 years, and even 50 years ago when it first opened, to come and share this exhibition and the story with us. So after we worked with Naomi Hirahara on this exhibition, we realized that she could help us look more into this camellia acquisition story. And we hired her to go ahead and do some additional research, talking with the Yoshimura and Uematsu families, and to create some written pieces that we could use in a variety of ways at the gardens. And these resulted in some different kinds of displays. You know, when we're working with visitors, we are looking for a variety of ways to communicate. People learn in all different ways. They're going to interact and notice different parts of the garden and different visits that different times they come. So we really want to try to have a variety of things. We put some new displays in the Bodie House in our interpretive center that had some updated text describing this transaction, and also included some additional images of Uematsu's and this amazing American Camellia yearbook article that was written about him quite a long time ago. We were able in 2019 to add some new wayfinding and interpretive signage to our gardens. These are 4-paneled pieces that sit out in the landscape and lead to different areas of the garden. And we, again, were able to pull some of this new research and new understanding and new language and incorporate it here about our camellias. And this even ended up on places like the website, where we can rethink our language and tell our story more accurately. And then around 2019, we were approached by Dr. Wendy Chang. She's an associate professor of American Studies at Scripps College and a Descanso member. And she was just interested in Descanso and became interested in this camellia story and asked if she could have access to our archives and do a bit more research. And we were excited to do this. You know, we had this question, we'd had Naomi do this valuable research for us. And so Wendy coming on, she just kind of built on the foundation that had laid already and was able to dig more and learn more and share more with us. And she published this article very recently talking about Descanso and the acquisition of camellias. And that was really impactful for us. It had a lot of detail, a lot of information, and it came at a really good time for the garden when we were doing a lot of reflection. We shared this back out with visitors in a variety of ways. In February 2021, we did a seasonal installation in the garden focusing on camellias that had a variety of components. And one of them was this self-guided walk. This is the two-sided walk that's shown here on the screen that pulled from some of the work that Naomi and Wendy did and connected it with what people were able to see in the landscape with the camellias and the different collections in the Japanese garden that they were able to see. So they're able to walk through the garden and read these bits of information and connect with those stories. We also had some local camellia societies do some beautiful displays of camellias for us in the Japanese garden. And we also partnered with our horticulture team very closely, and they came up with some really stunning and creative ways to showcase camellias in the Japanese garden again. And this is Autumn Ayers, who's our plant records coordinator shown, and also Diana Nightingale, who's our camellia horticulturist. And also very important, horticulture was really motivated by all of this new learning to think of a new way to bring the story of Uematsu camellias into the landscape so that visitors could see it. And so they developed this new system of a new addition to our plant labeling system, where camellias that were from Mr. Uematsu's nursery were identified with these specially colored tags and this little star icon, and made sure to call out that there was a Uematsu introduction. As a result of all this, all together combined, we had some really great feedback from visitors. So, you know, some good indications that it was making an impact. Our communications and marketing team did a wonderful article in our newsletter as well. So all these pieces all together combined to impact people in different ways. And some, you know, people were able to share back with us that they noticed that our efforts to tell the story more accurately and thoroughly, and they appreciated it, and it gave new meaning to the gardens for them. And this is a piece that was on the local news, and it will be about 4-minute video, but I want to share it because I think it does a nice job of summarizing why these efforts were important and some of the impact. And you'll see some of the families, the members of the Yoshimura and Uematsu families in this video as well. So here we go.
In honor of Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, one of Southern California's most beloved gardens is rewriting part of its rich history to recognize a part of their legacy that, frankly, most of us did not know about. Bob DeCastro's there at Descanso Gardens. You were there not too long ago, but there's a special visit there today, a purpose behind this.
Absolutely. And the more time I spend here, Michaela, you realize what a magical place it is, filled with so much wonderment. It is a landscape, as you said, that is filled with so much legacy. And Descanso Gardens is working really hard to preserve its heritage. It is a Southern California jewel, sparkling in hues of velvet red, blush pink, and peach. The vast camellia collection at Descanso Gardens is the largest in North America and an envy across the globe.
People come from all over the world to see our camellias because it's such a diverse collection, and it goes back so far. Some of our camellias are 20 feet tall, so they've been around for quite some time.
Their roots run deep, but a new look into the history of this brightly colored forest has unearthed a controversial and dim past. Wendy Chang is an associate professor of American Studies at Scripps College.
Japanese flower growers, right before the war, they made up 50% of the LA flower market. And so they were really instrumental in transforming, bringing those varieties to Southern California and really transforming the landscape into the beautiful landscape that we know today.
Chang's research revealed this immigrant cultivar, FM Uematsu, was the first to import dozens of the most beautiful varieties of camellias. But as Japanese Americans were being sent to internment camps during World War II, the Uematsus and another growing family, the Yoshimuras, were forced to quickly liquidate their life's work. The owner of the La Cañada Flint Ridge estate at the time, E. Manchester Body, purchased their nursery stocks before they were imprisoned. And for decades, Descanso Gardens had been told the rare camellias were sold at a fair price. Chang says in reality, Body paid about 1/5 to 1/4 of its estimated value.
Manchester Bodie is not the villain of the story. You know, he was a man of his time, and he was genuinely a friend to the Japanese American community, as many people have said. He was also a businessman, and so what he paid the families was still a fraction of the value they would have gotten if they had not been forced to sell due to internment.
It's believed Body even took credit for the new varieties of camellias, originally bred by these prominent Japanese American growers. Descanso is now giving them long overdue recognition.
This is the label we started with, and you can see we put Uematsu Introduction Japan underneath.
New signage reflecting contributions of two proud families.
It's pretty huge. The fact that he's being recognized posthumously for what he contributed and at the loss that he took on his camellias and how much he loved them. It's bittersweet that they're still here.
I'm very impressed by the attempts that they're making at trying to include us and show the history behind of where these plants came.
It was extremely unjust and horrifying, really, that happened, you know, to American citizens.
The blooms now have added significance.
It's impossible now not to think of the history that they have, and I look at them in a completely different way. I think when I first, you know, came here without even knowing, you know, they were just another flower.
A symbol of strength and resilience and a reclaiming of history.
I think that Descanso is a really inspiring example of how a public institution can acknowledge past injustices and create something beautiful out of that in the present. And I think that's something all Angelenos who love Descanso Gardens should be proud of.
In honor of Asian American Pacific.
So we were so happy to have that wonderful piece done for us, strengthening our relationships with the members of those two families. And we're excited looking towards the next year in February 2022. Amy Uematsu and Peter Levitt are going to collaborate with us on putting together a series of programs celebrating camellias in a poetic celebration. So Amy Uematsu is the granddaughter of FM Uematsu, the nurseryman from whom Mr. Bodie acquired so many of the camellias that are at Descanso today. And she's also a renowned poet. And we have been wanting to do poetry at the gardens. And so this just seemed like such a wonderful fit. She suggested to us that maybe she would help us. And really, I took it as a sign that that all this work to build this community, a sense of relationship between us and the Uematsus is in a moving forward in a positive way. Peter Levitt is one of her mentors and teachers and a Zen poet, and we're happy to have him help us as well. So this is exciting and coming up soon, and we're very much looking forward to it. And just to conclude, I hope that some of these things were interesting and inspiring, and I'm sure you're finding many meaningful ways to be creative and innovative with the public programs you're doing in your gardens. I really encourage you to look for opportunities to go deep and to use these public programs as motivation to learn more, build meaningful connections, find multiple ways to share stories with your visitors and your staff and your volunteers as well, so your whole institution is doing this learning and growing together. And I think all of this really helps people connect, helps them find ways that the gardens are important to them. Thank you.
I'm the Cultural Programs Manager for the Seattle Japanese Garden. I've been working at the Seattle Japanese Garden since January 2016, and I'm so excited to share a little bit of information about our public programs with you today. It's really wonderful to be a virtual participant at the 2021 NAJGA conference. I wish I could be there in person with you, but since I can't be, I thought it would be a nice idea to take you guys on a very rainy tour of the Seattle Japanese Garden while I talk about our programs. So I'll start things out with a little bit of background information about the Seattle Japanese Garden. Our garden was built in 1960, and in 2020 we celebrated our 60th anniversary. The Seattle Japanese Garden is only 3.5 acres, so not very large, and in a usual year we'll get upwards of 120,000 visitors coming through our front gate. That's a lot of people going through a not very large space, and so we're always thinking about how we can manage crowds. In 2016, when I started at the garden, we had a series of really wonderful festivals, the sorts of things that are probably familiar to you, Tanabata, Kodomo no Hi, festivals like that were largely volunteer-led by our truly fantastic garden volunteers. And these festivals were very popular. They had really great attendance rates, and our community loved them, but we were reaching the point where the garden would be overwhelmed by a one-day festival. With that in mind, we started on a journey to create public programming that was sustainable. It wouldn't have a negative impact on our garden landscape, and it could be accomplished by our very small garden staff with the help of volunteers. Accessible to a diverse audience and to our local community, and garden-driven, not doing everything we could do, and instead choosing meaningful activities related to our space and our history. So with those three things in mind, sustainability, accessibility, and garden-driven content, we moved forward with a new program model. Starting in 2017, we premiered 2 monthly programs, the first being Free First Thursday, which was focused on arts, and the second being Family Saturday, which was focused on family-friendly activities, especially those for small children. So I'll talk about both of these programs and what brought us to each one. Here in Seattle and in many other cities around the country as well, museums and other art galleries and arts organizations participate in something called Free First Thursday, which is exactly what it sounds. It's free entry on the first day of the month. We decided that Free First Thursday made sense for our garden because it offered a time for our public, especially our local community, to come and visit us with no entrance fee. Even though the garden fee at the time was only $6, that can be prohibitive for a lot of families. So we wanted to create a new time for them to come and enjoy this space. We also were thinking about the type of organization that we wanted to be if we were doing Free First Thursday and the Seattle Art Museum was also doing Free First Thursday. It aligned us with the kind of organizations that we wanted to work with. So in spring of 2017, we started advertising Free First Thursdays, and we're almost immediately overwhelmed with how popular it was. Not as popular as a big Tanabata festival, but huge crowds coming to the garden. One of the first times that we ever did it, a bus full of theater students showed up from a local high school, which was both exhilarating and very stressful in that exact moment, just watching this bus pull up to the garden full of kids. It made perfect sense to us to offer arts programming during these free hours to encourage people to come to the garden and learn. We started doing koto performances. We brought in a shakuhachi flute player. We had haiku workshops, and buto dancers come and interact with the garden space. We used our small community room space and started filling the walls just like an art gallery. We brought in a local high school to do a photography exhibit, and we've partnered now with all sorts of incredible local artists. Most recently, our community room was actually filled with art by Michelle Kumada, and she worked with us to create brand new art about the history of the Seattle Japanese Garden, reflecting on our 60-year history, and it was in the community room as part of our 60th year anniversary celebration. The first year that we did Free First Thursday, we were scrambling, just trying to find anyone who'd be willing to work with us, artists who'd be willing to hang their work in the space. And by the third year, I think, we actually had people contacting us and asking to bring their art and show it in our space or to perform in our garden. So that was a really quick and really incredible turnaround for that program. We took a short break from Free First Thursday due to the COVID pandemic, and we are working on bringing it back for 2022, and we're so excited to be able to offer live performances and activities in the garden again next year. The other program that we developed at this time is Family Saturday, which is focused on bringing children into the garden, as you can tell by our not terribly creative name. We decided that one Saturday a month, we were going to focus on little kids and families who otherwise might be intimidated by the many rules that can come from visiting a Seattle Japanese, or visiting, any Japanese garden. Rules like no running, no climbing trees, we don't allow in balls or bats or exciting toys, and that can make our garden a little bit intimidating for families with young children. We decided the best way to welcome them in was with activities that were age appropriate and educational. Things like origami workshops, puppet shows of classical Japanese stories. We worked with our local Japan America Society to offer some programs teaching kids about the Japanese school day. Whatever we could think of that might be exciting for a 5-year-old. Ultimately, changing our programming from annual festivals to monthly smaller activities has been incredibly successful for our garden. We advertise for our programs in libraries, community centers, and on parenting websites. And people do really come back again and again to experience different activities, and I think in the end we see families coming more often to enjoy this space. That isn't to say that we've given up entirely on festivals. Every year we have Tanabata in July, and we have a very successful 10-day maple viewing festival. On this walk, you can kind of see the tail end of our colorful maples, unfortunately after a big windstorm. So it's really the end of maple viewing season, but it's still beautiful. And we do still have visitors coming right until we close for the year. There are so many things that I could talk about when it comes to programs in the garden, but I really don't want to miss mentioning our amazing tea groups who offer 3 seatings each weekend day in a normal season at the garden. We have representatives of both the Omote Senke and the Ura Senke school who come to our tea house, which you saw me walk through earlier. And it's so wonderful to work with those groups and have them offer tea ceremony in our garden. I think I've taken up just about my fair share of time this morning, so I'll wrap up. Thanks for coming on this rainy walk with me. I was completely soaked by the end of it, but it was very worth it. You'll notice that we didn't have a lot of people in the garden on rainy days. I think it's a shame because it's one of the most beautiful and peaceful times to visit. I hope you find time to come visit the Seattle Japanese Garden sometime soon. Thank you.